Welcome to the Kwibuka podcast, written by Dr. Jean Damascene Bizimana, minister at Minubumwe, and recorded by Josue Ishema. After years of research, he has collected and compiled information on different actions that led to the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. In today's segment, we will discuss the contribution of President Habyarimana in the preparation and execution of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. The genocide perpetrated against the Tutsi in Rwanda 30 years ago, between April and July 1994, was the result of the individual involvement of the political and military authorities led by the President of the Republic, Major General Juvenal Habyarimana, and his closest circle, centered around his wife, Agathe Kanziga. The armed conflict initiated by the Rwandan Patriotic Front (RPF) on 1st October 1990 to liberate the country from a notorious criminal regime served as a pretext for President Habyarimana's inner circle to prepare and execute a plan for the systematic and total extermination of all the Tutsis in Rwanda and the liquidation of Hutus opposed to the genocidal plan. The implementation of this plan to eliminate the Tutsi was no secret to anyone, as Rwandan officials mentioned it openly. The Western embassies and chancelleries present in Kigali mentioned it to their respective governments, in particular the French diplomats, even though they were very close to the Habyarimana regime. President Habyarimana's responsibility in the preparation of the genocide lies in the fact that he himself planned its conception and supported it in all sectors of civil, political, and military life between 1990 and 1994. The existence of this genocidal plan was already reported in 1990 by Western embassies. Here are three examples. On the 13th October 1990, Colonel René Galinier, defense attaché at the French embassy in Rwanda, sent his superiors in France a confidential dispatch endorsed by Ambassador Georges Martre, in which he noted the seriousness of the genocide that had begun in Kibirira, Ngororero district, in the following terms. Hutu peasants organized by the MRND have intensified the search for suspected Tutsis in the hills. Massacres have been reported in the Kibirira region to the northwest of Gitarama. As has already been reported, the risk of this confrontation becoming widespread seems to be a reality. On 15th October 1990, the French ambassador to Rwanda, Georges Martre, sent a telegram to the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, Admiral Langsade, who was also President Mitterrand's private chief of staff, in which Martre used the expression of genocide to describe the killings that were taking place in Rwanda on authorization of President Juvenal Habyarimana. Here is an extract from the telegram. The Rwandan population of Tutsi origin believes that the military coup de main failed in its psychological consequences because it did not achieve results quickly enough to prevent the mobilization of the Hutus against the prospect of the return of the former monarchy. It is still counting on a military victory thanks to the support of men and resources from the diaspora, and this military victory, however partial, will enable it to escape the genocide. In 1998, when Ambassador Martre was questioned by the French Parliamentary Committee, led by MP Paul Kiel, he gave a fuller explanation of this genocidal plan, revealing that Colonel Laurent Serubuga, Deputy Chief of Staff of the Rwandan Army, who was President Habyarimana's number 2, had told him that the Rwandan authorities were ready to eliminate the Tutsis. The genocide was foreseeable from that period of 1990. Some Hutus had even dared to hint at it. Colonel Serubuga, Deputy Chief of Staff of the Rwandan Army, was delighted with the RPF attack, which would serve as justification for the massacres of the Tutsis. Genocide was a daily haunting for the Tutsis. From the beginning of October 1990, several thousand people were imprisoned in Kigali, most of them because they belonged to the Tutsi minority or because they had sympathies or shared interest with the Tutsis. 4 days later, on 19th October 1990, Colonel Galinier sent a new diplomatic dispatch to France in which he mentioned the existence of a more widespread plan to kill Tutsis throughout Rwandan territory. He wrote in these terms, "There is a possibility of serious atrocities being unleashed against the Tutsi population in the interior. which would be either spontaneous or directly encouraged by the most hardline members of the current regime, thus playing their own game. A document dated 19th November 1990 from the head of the intelligence service at the sub-prefecture of Ngororero gives details of these programs. Commune of Kibirira, 352 people killed, including 345 Tutsis and 7 Hutus. 45 Tutsis were injured. 423 houses were burnt down, and 124 were destroyed. 387 cows and 173 small livestock were slaughtered. 3,365 Tutsis took refuge in the parish of Mohororo. Commune of Satinski, 20 Tutsis killed, 8 injured, 7 houses burnt down, 92 destroyed, 112 cows slaughtered, 915 Tutsis left their properties. Commune of Ramba, there were no deaths, but 7 houses were burnt down and 17 others destroyed. Also, 17 cows were butchered, 200 Tutsis left their properties. These figures provided by the intelligence service cannot be scrupulously relied upon, as the Habyarimana regime used various tricks to minimize the number of people killed and property destroyed in order not to reveal their intensity and to protect the perpetrators of these horrors. These figures show that the Tutsis of Ngororero were cruelly persecuted. None of his murderers has ever been brought to justice. The first and most senior person responsible of this de facto impunity is the President of the Republic, Juvenal Habyarimana, the supreme head of the Rwandan judiciary at the time. Another striking fact that shows President Habyarimana's responsibility in the genocidal plan from the outset in October 1990 was the hunt for Tutsi civilians that began on the night of 4th to 5th October 1990. To this end, President Habyarimana's regime staged an RPF attack by firing into the city of Kigali. Afterward, gendarmes, soldiers, mayors, sector councillors, and intelligence officers searched homes and arrested many people, mostly Tutsis. Around 10,000 people were arrested. None of them had committed any offense. They were simply Tutsis accused of being accomplices of the Inhotanyi or Hutus suspected of colluding with Tutsis. For example, the late Abbé Modeste Mungwarareba, then director of the Minor Seminary of Rwanda in Butare and professor of chemistry at the National University of Rwanda, was one of those detained in Butare prison. He gave information about what happened to him, notably in an interview with the French newspaper La Croix on 4th July 1994. He said, "In 1990, at the start of the war, I was arrested and detained. I spent 6 months in prison without knowing why I was being held. They claimed that I had had relations with the RPF because I am Tutsi, but I knew nothing about the RPF." On 18th October 1990, Justice Minister Theoneste Mujyanama held a press conference on the arrest and detention of what he called the Ibyitso or accomplices. To justify the large number of Tutsis arrested and detained, he stated that the fact that they belong to the same ethnic group as those who attacked the country places them in the category of those who should be under more suspicion than others. The mounting of accusation of ethnic grounds has been source of denial of justice against many people. We cannot talk about President Habyarimana's role in the preparation of genocide without mentioning the terrible speech he gave on 17th November 1992 at a meeting of his supporters at the Ruhengeri Stadium, in which he clearly announced the genocide by asking the Secretary General of the MRND to buy new uniforms for the Interahamwe militiamen and to dress them appropriately, taking care to say publicly that when the time comes, the president himself gave orders to attack with his militiamen. This attack was intended primarily to target Tutsis who were then considered indiscriminately enemies of the Republic. On 25th November 1992, the MDR party sent a letter to the President Habyarimana in which the MDR denounced an attack carried out in Chirongi commune on 15th November 1992 by the Interahamwe accompanied by soldiers in civilian clothes. The attack was led by the mayor of Chirongi, Alexandre Hitimana, who had distributed rifles. 6 people were killed, and more than 500 abandoned their properties in their flight. The Interahamwe were supported by their fellow militiamen who had come from the Remera village of Kigali under President Habyarimana's brother-in-law, Aloys Ngirabatware. The MDR party claimed that such abuses were supported by the Minister of the Interior, Faustin Munyazesa, the prefect of Kigali Rural, Com Bizimungu, the burgomaster of Shyorongi, Alexandre Hitimana, and the MP, Bonaventure Habimana, a former Secretary General of the MRND and a native of Shyorongi. The letter ended by pointing out to President Habyarimana that the killings were linked to his speech in Ruhengeri a week earlier, in which he had declared that he did not believe in the Arusha Accords and that when the time comes, he would mobilize his Interahamwe. These words galvanized his supporters. The letter recommended that President Habyarimana reinstate the war, displace to their properties, ensure the security of all Rwandans, and punish all those who had participated in these acts of violence. It was signed by Bonaventure Ubarijoro, President of the MDR in Kigali, André Rwajekare, Vice President of the MDR in Kigali, Anastase Gasana, Secretary of the MDR in Kigali, and Juvenal Banzamihigo, Treasurer of the MDR in Kigali. In January 1993, an international commission of inquiry led by the International Federation of Human Rights Leagues carried out investigations in Rwanda and discovered several graves in which the bodies of Bagogwe Tutsi victims killed by the Habyarimana regime had been buried in the prefectures of Ruhengeri and Gisenyi. The commission was made up of 10 experts from different countries. Jean Carbonard from France, chairman of the group, Philippe Dahinden from Switzerland, René Denis-Ségu from Côte d'Ivoire, Alison Deforge from United States of America, Eric Gillet from Belgium, William Shabazz from Canada, Alidou Ouedraogo from Burkina Faso, André Paradis from Canada, Rein Odink from Netherlands, and Paul Dondival from Belgium. The searches carried out by the investigators established a total toll of 277 people killed in March 1991 alone. The commission noted that most of these victims were young men who had died from multiple fractures of the skull and face caused by blunt instruments. These massacres occurred in several Ruhengeri communes, including Muli, Kinigi, Mukingo, and Gisenyi, such as Gaseke, Giciye, Karago, Mutura, Kanama, Rwerere. The commission established that local civilian and military authorities were involved in the killings, including the prefect of Ruhengeri, Charles Nzabagerageza, and the prefect of Gisenyi, Com Bizimungu, as well as the mayors of the communes concerned. Prefect Nzabagerageza was President Habyarimana's cousin and had married his wife's cousin, Agathe Kanziga. The commission also noted the direct involvement of other dignitaries of the regime, including Public Works Minister Joseph Nzirorera, Colonel Elisa Gatwa, an advisor to President Habyarimana, and Protais Zigiranyirazo, the president's brother-in-law. On the evening of 28 January 1993, Jean Carbonard, president of the commission, had just returned from Rwanda and was invited by presenter Bruno Massure to appear on the France 2 news program. The systemization of the massacres of civilians, which had nothing to do with ethnic clashes, but rather were part of an organized policy in which the involvement of those in power is striking to a high degree in this genocide, this crime against humanity, we insist on these words. Jean Carbonard's speech was punctuated by images of a mass grave of human bones found by investigators in the communes of Mutura in Gisenyi and Kinigi in Ruhengeri. In Rwanda, Carbonard was received by Ambassador Martre, who described in detail the seriousness of the events observed by the commission he chaired. Following this meeting, Martre sent a letter to Bruno Delay, President Mitterrand's advisor on African affairs, showing the seriousness of the human rights violations that were taking place in Rwanda under President Juvenal Habyarimana. He said, "Mr. Carbonard has kept me informed of the results obtained so far by this mission. It has collected an impressive amount of information on the massacres that have taken place since the start of the war in October 1990, and more particularly on those of the Bagogwe, a Tutsi ethnic group, after the attack on Ruhengeri in January 1991. As far as the facts are concerned, continued the French ambassador, the report will only add horror to horror already known. President Habyarimana himself allegedly started the massacres during a meeting with his close associates. During this meeting, the operation was programmed with orders to carry out systematic genocide, using, if necessary, the army and involving the local population in the killings, no doubt to increase their solidarity in the fight against the enemy ethnic group. The Commission's finding provoked a reaction from the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, which decided to send a special rapporteur, summary and arbitrary executions, Mr. Bakr Walin Diaye, a Senegalese national, to Rwanda. He submitted his report on 11 August 1993, in which he established that the Tutsi population is the target of the large-scale attacks and massacres carried out by the elements of the FARC, the administrative authorities, and the militias of the MRND and the SEDER. These killings raised the question of genocide, the expert concluded. Bakr Walin Diaye indicated that these massacres were organized by the authorities and targeted the Tutsis as their ethnic group, and added that there was a risk of genocide in Rwanda if the United Nations did nothing to prevent it. At the time Diaye and his team were carrying out their investigation in Rwanda, President Habyarimana's regime was implementing an entire genocide preparation program. The creation of radio stations and media preaching hatred, recruitment and military training of the militias and their arming, creation of extremist political parties, distribution of machetes and weapons to the ethnically selected population, drawing up of lists of people to be killed, etc. During the period from 31st January 1993 to 13th February 1993, on the orders of President Habyarimana, himself under pressure from the Colonel Bagosora, the opposition Minister of Foreign Affairs, Boniface Ngurinzira, was informed that he had been relieved of his duties as head of the Rwandan delegation to the peace negotiations, and was replaced by the Minister of Defense, James Gasana, at the MRND Presidential Party. Prime Minister Dismas Nsengiyaremye strongly denounced this decision. At the time, negotiations were due to address the question of merging the two armies, and the extremist no longer wanted Ngurinzira because of his probity. This decision clearly shows that President Habyarimana and his extremists wanted to exclude Minister Ngurinzira from the Arusha peace negotiations because they did not appreciate the fact that he was in favor of these negotiations, even accusing him of having sold the country out because he was in favor of power sharing between the MRND and its opposition. Generally speaking, 1993 was a year of intensified military training for Interahamwe, but also of meetings to prepare for the genocide. Some of these known meetings are as follows. On 17th November 1993, the Army Chief of Staff, Colonel Deogratias Nsabimana, led a meeting at the Byumba military camp, including officers from this prefecture. At the end of the meeting, it was decided that all these officers should mobilize their troops and the population to avenge their brothers massacred by the Inkotanyi. The press release of the newspaper Le Flambeau, issue number 3 of 6 December 1993, mentions large-scale massacres and notes, "What is shameful is that they are not planning to take revenge on the RPF, but rather to take revenge by massacring the Tutsis in the interior of the country." On 18th November 1993, Joseph Nzirorera, Secretary General of the MRND, chaired a meeting at Remera in Mufe, in the town of Kigali Rural, which brought together all the leaders of the Interahamwe. This meeting decided to launch a civil war throughout the country, starting with Kigali and the surrounding area, followed by the towns of Gitarama, Nyanza, Utare, and Rwamagana. These towns were targeted as a priority because they were densely populated by Tutsi and opposition Hutus. On 20th November 1993, President Juvenal Habyarimana led a meeting at his Rebero Horizon Hotel in Kigali. It was decided to distribute weapons including grenades, rifles, and machetes to the Interahamwe and Impuzamugambi militias, which were to be used to exterminate the opposition Tutsis and Hutus. These weapons were distributed using Onatracom public buses under the supervision of the Minister of Transport and Communication, André Ntagerura. On 21st November 1993, President Habyarimana led a similar meeting at the Rwandan Army headquarters. The meeting aimed to mobilize the officers to become more involved in fighting against the Inhotanyi and the Belgians. They were looking for a pretext to derail the establishment of the transitional government. At the beginning of 1994, the extremists who were preparing for the genocide met again and refined the plan to disseminate weapons among the Interahamwe in rural areas. They published a procedural manual entitled Organization of Civil Self-Defense. This manual was one of many documents seized by ICTR police officers from Jean Kambanda's personal effects when he was arrested in Nairobi in 1997. It does not mention the names of its authors or even the date of its publication, but Jean Kambanda confirmed during his trial at the ICTR that it was a confidential document. The researchers who analyzed it compared it with other writings from the same period and concluded that it was written between mid-February and early March 1994. This document provides information on the resolutions of this meeting to provide the population with the means of popular resistance under the supervision of the army, starting with the regions bordering Uganda. The first to receive weapons were the communal police officers, reservists, and politicians who were convinced that they were defending the gains of democracy and the republic. In other words, the followers of Hutu power. The Minister of the Interior and the Minister of Defense were responsible for implementing this plan. The Prime Minister, Agathe Uwiringiyimana, was not informed because the meeting members had realized that she was not a member of the Hutu power movement. This document reveals that 4,995 rifles and 499,500 rounds of ammunition were needed for each commune. This arsenal was to be backed up by traditional weapons, arrows, spears, etc. On 7th January 1994, a meeting was held at MRND headquarters, chaired by the party's president, Mathieu Ngirumpatse, and attended by the Minister of Defense, Augustin Bizimana, the Chief of Staff of the Rwandan Armed Forces, General Deogratias Nsabimana, the Chief of Staff of the Gendarmerie, General Augustin Ndindirimana, and the President of the MRND militias, the Interahamwe, Robert Kajuga. At this high-level meeting, revealed by the Belgian intelligence services, it was decided to thwart UNAMIR's weapons searches and move them to other caches. Under no circumstances could such an operation to hide weapons intended to commit genocide be carried out without the knowledge and approval of the President of the Republic, Juvenal Habyarimana. The proof is that on the following day, 8th January 1994, the Rwandan army distributed arms to the Interahamwe militia in the northern prefectures of Gisenyi and Ruhengeri. On the same day in Kigali, a violent demonstration of Interahamwe militias armed with grenades and surrounded by paracommandos from Kankanombe and members of the Presidential Guard in civilian clothes blocked access to parliament, where an attempt was to be made to swear in the transitional government. The Rwandan gendarmerie hardly intervened, not even UNAMIR. On 11th January 1994, General Dallaire, Commander-in-Chief of UNAMIR, sent a fax to General Maurice Baril, head of the military division of the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations, informing him that UNAMIR had precise information on arms caches in the capital Kigali and on the training of militias capable of killing more than 1,000 people a day. This text was also sent to the ambassadors accredited in Kigali. The UN refused to authorize confiscation of these weapons. On 12 January 1994, General Dallaire and Jacques Roger Boubou, the UN Special Representative in Rwanda, informed the ambassadors of France, the United States, and Belgium of the existence of these weapons and the militia's intentions to carry out massacres. On the same day, Dallaire and Boubou met President Habyarimana to ask him to put an immediate end to all subversive activities of this kind. On the same day, they met the leaders of the MRND, but nothing concrete was done by these various authorities, starting with the head of state himself. On the same date, the French ambassador to Rwanda, Jean-Michel Marlot, sent a telegram to the Minister of Foreign Affairs on the situation in Rwanda, in which he explained that he had received reliable and secret information from reliable sources, and that he had solid proof that systematic and widespread massacres were being planned in the country. Ambassador Marlot explained that there would be first provocations aimed to the RPF troops stationed in Kigali to encourage them to react, to defend themselves, after which the pretext would be found to massacre the Tutsis, starting with those living in Kigali. The ambassador added that the Rwandan military who had prepared this plan had planned to collaborate with 1,700 Interahamwe militiamen posted in Kigali who had received training and weapons to kill Tutsis, with the capacity to kill at least 1,000 from the very first hour of the massacres. On the 15th January 1994, the ambassadors of Belgium, France, and the United States made a joint approach to President Habyarimana to ask him to hold these preparations. But once again, these approaches were hardly followed up by any concrete action. On 16th January 1994, the MRND and the Hutu Power member parties, MDR and PL, held a major meeting at the Nyamirambo Stadium, during which arms were distributed. On 19th January 1994, Prime Minister Agathe Uwiringiyimana sent a letter to MRND ministers accusing Defense Minister Augustin Bizimana of distributing weapons to the population and urging them to recover them, but to not avail. On 17th February 1994, President Habyarimana led a meeting of senior officers of the National Gendarmerie commanded by General Augustin Bizimana. He discussed with them, among other things, the ongoing stalemate in setting up the broad-based transitional institutions provided for in the Arusha Peace Agreement and the possibility of a resumption of the war. Habyarimana warned them, if the RPF starts the war, we have plans to deal with their accomplices. In these words, the genocide was announced in unambiguous terms. Killing the Tutsis had become a matter for the state, which means that the gendarmes, ordinarily responsible for ensuring security, could massacre the Tutsi as soon as the authorities gave them the order to start doing so. On 18th February 1994, the Directorate General for External Security of the French Intelligence Services, DGSE, drew up a secret memo reporting real ethnic massacres that had claimed the lives of more than 300 people, counted in the preceding weeks, killed by the Rwandan army and militias with the participation or encouragement of the local authorities. In this memo, the DGSE announced that these massacres were part of a plan for the total extermination of the Tutsis. This would be part of a major program of the ethnic cleansing directed against the Tutsis. The following day, 19th February 1994, General Christian Quesnot, President Mitterrand's private chief of staff, and Dominique Pin, who was number 2 in the French presidency's Africa department, Élysée Palace, presented President Mitterrand with 2 main options regarding Rwanda. The first was to evacuate French nationals and withdraw the military component of Opération Roi. Still, at the same time, Quesnot and Pin rejected it, advising President Mitterrand not to consider it. It would mean the failure of our presence and our policy in Rwanda. Our credibility on the continent would suffer. The second option is the one which Dominique Pin considers the capture of Kigali by the RPF. Immediately, he asserts that in such a case, ethnic massacres will escalate, and consequently, France must increase its efforts to support the regime more than ever to prevent the RPF from taking Kigali. The French authorities are aware that the President Habyarimana's regime is contemplating genocide but persist in their unconditional support for it. All these warning signs are sufficient proof that the genocide committed against the Tutsis was the result of a carefully thought-out plan by President Habyarimana's government. On 20th February 1994, the Chief of Staff of the Rwandan Army, General Nsabimana Deogratias, showed his cousin, Bidara Jean Berkmans, who had been governor of the National Bank of Rwanda, a list of 1,500 Tutsis who were to be murdered. In a Belgian newspaper dated 24th May 1994, Bidara revealed that he had passed on this information to the members of the delegation that the European Union had sent to Rwanda, and especially to the Belgian embassy. The 1997 Belgian Senate report states that the then Belgian ambassador to Rwanda, Johan Swinnen, confirmed this information during a hearing before the Belgian Senate. Reports from foreign embassies posted in Rwanda in 1994 indicate the concordance of several elements of direct incitement to genocide in March 1994. For example, a telex dated 1st March 1994, sent to the Belgian authorities by the Belgian ambassador to Rwanda, Johan Swinen, in which he indicated that RTLM was broadcasting inflammatory statements calling for hatred, even the extermination of the other component of the population. A Belgian intelligence document, dated 2nd March 1994, stated that an MRND informer had revealed to the Belgian authorities that the MRND had drawn up a plan to exterminate all the Tutsis in Kigali if the RPF opened hostilities. The information added, if things go wrong, the Hutus will massacre them without mercy, and added that regional divisions no longer exist and army morale has never been so high. On 3rd March 1994, Major Podevenge of UNAMIR informed Dallaire that arms were being distributed to militias in Gikondo district, which was one of the CEDER's major strongholds. On 10th March, UNAMIR discovered several quantities of heavy weapons intended for the Rwandan army and reported an increase in the recruitment of militias and soldiers. Dallaire requested authorization from the UN to confiscate these weapons and asked for reinforcement from the peacekeepers. He never received a positive response. It was also during March 1994 that the last orders for machetes placed by Felicien Kabuga with the British company Chillington were delivered. A few weeks later, they were used as instruments to perpetrate the genocide. UNAMIR noted that in March 1994, large quantities of ammunition had been clandestinely extracted from the armories of the Kanombe military camp and distributed without UNAMIR's knowledge to the various army camps in the interior of the country, in particular that of Gitarama. These arms distribution were aimed at preparing for war, halting the Arusha peace agreement, and distributing arms to be used during the genocide. Belgian warrant officer Benoit Doby, who was in charge of weapons maintenance at the Kanombe military camp, testified before the Belgian military prosecutor. He stated, "I had access to all the ammunition shops at Kanombe before the attack. A large part of the depot had been emptied of its contents. These quantities of ammunition extracted were vast. For example, the distribution of 1,120 mm mortar shells in Gitarama. Around 20% of the ammunition remained in the depot. This was about a month before the attack on Habyarimana's plane, and it took a whole week to transport them. A lieutenant in the FAR told me that it was in anticipation of an RPF attack, but I think it was done to escape the control of the UN observers. I know that the figures provided by the FAR General Staff to the UN were wrong because they did not consider what had been distributed en masse. All that mattered was the situation in the warehouse, which was almost empty. A German military aid worker told me that a lot of ammunition had been moved during the night." The purpose of concealing weapons from UNAMIR was to prevent it from controlling their use so that the Rwandan army could use them for massacres that could not be prevented by UNAMIR, whose mandate required it to concentrate essentially on the city of Kigali. On 29 March 1994, the military commanders of the Rwandan army met again. They determined the strategy for defending the district of Kigali and tracking down and neutralizing infiltrators in various sectors of the city. In the report of this meeting to the Minister of Defense and the Army Chief of Staff, it was decided that specific soldiers and reservists would be responsible for training civilians in close collaboration with the administrative authorities. The report noted that the Minister of the Interior and the Minister of Defense should rapidly assemble the weapons to be distributed to the civilians carrying out the operations. The commander of the armies in the city of Kigali informed the participants that, in most city districts, the setting up of groups to implement the plan had been completed and that they were only awaiting the distribution of weapons and other equipments as soon as possible. However, during this meeting, they mentioned the lack of weapons, which also required training for civilians, and the problems associated with handling traditional weapons, swords, spears, archery, machetes, and knives. The military commander of the city of Kigali was ordered to draw up an emergency list of soldiers who were not in the barracks. The prefect of the city of Kigali, Colonel Tarsis Renzaho, had also been ordered to do the same for reservists and to provide information on trustworthy civilians. The next day, the prefect sent the Army Chief of Staff a list containing many names of reservists and civilians who could be recruited to implement the plan. The list included the name, cell, sector, and commune of residence of each person retained. Lieutenant Colonel Baudouin Jacques Albert, who was a Belgian technical aid worker in Rwanda in his capacity as advisor to General Gratien Kabiligi, G3 of the FAR General Staff, was heard by the Belgian Military Prosecutor's Office on 5th May 1994 in his investigation into the assassination of the 10 Belgian peacekeepers. He revealed that the Rwandan defense minister had publicly announced that there would be a genocide if the RPF did not stop the war. He stated, "A month or two before the attack, I attended a party at General Habyarimana's house with the Belgian ambassador, Colonel Vincent, Colonel Marshall, Colonel Leroy, President Habyarimana, Augustin Bizimana from MINEDEF, and a few other Rwandan officers. In fact, on that occasion, it became clear, or rather it was reaffirmed, that the Rwandans could not accept Arusha. Bizimana told me after a few glasses of champagne that he was ready to engage the Rwandan army if the RPF did not play ball." 10 days before the attack, on the last Friday in March, Colonel Vincent, head of Belgian military cooperation in Rwanda, invited General Habyarimana and Colonel Kabiligi, the G3, to his house. And at this meeting, they again clearly stated that Arusha was not possible, that they would eventually accept early elections, and that if they wanted to impose Arusha, they could eliminate the RPF and the Tutsis, and that it would take a fortnight at the most. They seemed sure of themselves. The total of all these facts shows that the genocide perpetrated against the Tutsis between April and July 1994 did indeed begin in October 1990 under the direct responsibility of President Habyarimana, and that this genocide was the result of a well-developed methodical organization under the authority of General Habyarimana, which reached its climax in 1994. The reality of this plan was confirmed by Prime Minister Jean Kambanda at the time of the genocide when he pleaded guilty before the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, admitting, and I quote, "There was in Rwanda in 1994 a widespread and systematic attack directed against the Tutsi civilian population with the aim of exterminating its members." President Juvenal Habyarimana, who was in office between 5th July 1973 and 6th April 1994, died on the evening of 6th April 1994 in an attack on his plane carried out by extremists from his regime who fired on his plane from the Kanombe military camp before the plan was fully implemented. Is the person most responsible for it in his capacity as the highest state authority. His successor, Dr. Theodore Sindikubwabo, his mentor, Jean Kambanda, and several genocidaires such as Colonel Bagosora of sad memory and many other murderers found guilty by the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda are responsible for carrying out the genocidal plan prepared during Juvenal Habyarimana's lifetime and fully implemented by accompanying his brutal death, which they planned and executed. As we approach the 30th commemoration of the genocide committed against the Tutsis in Rwanda in 1994, let us remember the victims by continuing to work so that the motto "Never Again" is no longer a pious hope, but an actual reality for the future generations in Rwanda and around the world. Check out the rest of our podcast and share them with others